Um, my name is Anna Zobnina. I am the strategy and policy coordinator of the European Network of Migrant Women. I do not know how many of our participants are familiar with the work of our network or with the network at all. So I'm going to say a couple of words about who we are, what we do, and why we're here. And then we will move towards the main subject of our discussion today, or presentation, dealing with violence, violence against women, in particular within migrant populations. This will be quite general, introductory lecture because the subject is very broad, very difficult, and of course, potentially, I hope that we will explore some of the themes that we will mention today in more depth in future. So about the network. It's important to know that we are a relatively young network. When I say relatively young, I compare us with other big European platforms. We are a European network, such as, for example, European Women's Lobby or European Network Against Racism that have been there for 20 years. We were formalized in 2012. At the moment, our membership is around 50 migrant women organizations in 20 European countries, but we are expanding quite rapidly. Most of our members are grassroots service providers that are led by migrant women. They were established by migrant women and they're working with migrant women. Other members, they also do advocacy when the capacity allows them, primarily at either the local level or national level sometimes. And we are giving them platform also to do advocacy and participate in activities at the European level. Our ethnic and cultural, as well as religious representation in the network is very diverse. There are literally women coming from all over the world, from all regions. And the issues that our members are working with are also diverse. But one cross-cutting issue that affects all migrant women and as it affects all women is violence against women. So of course this subject is something that cross-cuts the work of pretty much every member in our network. Our main mission is quite simple. We are advocating for the equal rights and fair treatment for migrant and refugee women and girls in Europe. And this advocacy is also based or entrenched within our principles. And our principles are, of course, we work within international human rights law. It's the principle of justice and equal treatment of every human being. It's a principle of equality. Very importantly, we are a feminist organization. That means that we recognize structural inequalities and structural discrimination of women that have been historically developed due to the presence of patriarchy. We recognize the position of men as holding more power, including financial power in this world, financial and political power. And we're trying to remedy this by specific intervention actions and providing analysis. What is also important to know about us is that we are a secular organization. I'm mentioning this because I mentioned previously that we are inter-cultural, inter-ethnic, and also inter-religious group. Therefore, our main overarching principle is secularism. It allows us to advocate for principles of non-discrimination on the basis of religion, and it allows us to bring women of various religious denominations under one roof. And it also allows us, quite importantly, criticize religious institutions and ideologies that we consider as deeply patriarchal. So moving on, what we have to do before we speak about subjects such as violence against women within or working with violence in migrant populations. We, of course, need to clarify definitions. What do we mean by migrants? How do we define? Do we use legal terms? Do we stick to the definitions of the European Commission, for example? Or do we go with a popular discourse? Do we define migration within or only as coming from outside of the European Union, or whether it is also migrants who are migrating inside the European Union, and so on and so forth? This is fundamental to be clear about these definitions, because they will affect our methodology and the groups that we will select or to engage with. But also it's important to have in mind that those definitions are not fixed. So it's important to define the terms, to analyze them, but it's also important to allow for a certain degree of flexibility. So starting with the migrant, as I'm sure all of you are aware, there is the official definition of the European, used by the European Commission, that we'll work with. Like if you apply for funding, a MIF fund, it would say very clearly that the migrant is a person, it's a third country national. So it's somebody who moved inside Europe from outside the European Union and has not acquired yet the nationality. Which is why, for example, somebody like me, who I'm from Russia, and I left Russia over 15 years ago. I am the citizen of the European Union, but statistically, I'm not as a migrant anymore because I'm the European Union citizen. Then we have the refugees and asylum seekers. Of course, asylum seekers are those who are still seeking the refugee status, and then once they receive, they become officially recognized refugees, and then they can move on into naturalization. With these three categories, what is happening at the moment, there is a strong populist attack on the migrants and refugees generally, as we know in Europe. And the popular discourse invites us to pit different categories of migrants against each other. So they would very often say there are good migrants and bad migrants, and good migrants are refugees because they're fleeing immediate imminent danger or some kind of natural disaster or war. Therefore, it's a humanitarian kind of grounds for their protection that we provide, versus those who are seeking better life or economic opportunities. They are migrants, and they are the bad migrants. Again, as I said, for us, it is important to be clear about distinction between different categories, because of course, certain, women who are right now in refugee camps or hotspots in Italy or in Greece, they would be asylum seekers, or maybe some of them will be recognized refugees, and they have quite specific legal limitations and quite specific also history very often of trauma and sexual violence that not necessarily every migrant will experience. So it's important to have those distinctions in mind. However, in a bigger scheme of things, both asylum seekers and refugees on our books as a migrant women platform, we all fall into the umbrella of migrants. So for us migrants, it's more generally what we say when we say migrant women, we mean women on the move. It's the women who cross borders. It's the women who leave behind their stable, fixed life, their identity, their family, their assets, sometimes something that they accumulated in their life, their history, and move to a very new place. These dynamics are very important to understand, because it actually it impacts a lot of decision making and a lot of analysis that we have to employ in working with migrant women would be rooted in our understanding of this movement in space, movement across countries. It's a physical movement, but it is also a mental movement. Or, as opposed to it, some people move and migrate, but they leave their mind at home. And I will mention about this later. Then we have, of course, The definition, the third country national, now this is the official European Commission definition. And here again, we will be dealing with, let's say, women from Philippines working in Cyprus or in Greece, primarily domestic workers who have been in the country for, sometimes 20 years, and there is not even a prospect of them becoming European Union citizens. They still remain third country nationals. Normally if the laws of naturalization would be respected, they would not be considered legally migrants anymore, however they are. And then we have the category, of course, of undocumented persons, who very often they are undocumented from the beginning when they cross the border, and sometimes they become undocumented when they lose when their asylum application become rejected, or the visa, the job permit doesn't get renewed, and they shift into the undocumented status. These are particularly vulnerable people, also very difficult to reach and very difficult to engage with because of the fear of being disclosed to the authorities and deported. And obviously, one of the most difficult groups to report violence when it comes to violence against women. And the last group that I want to mention is the group of ethnic minority, which would be second and sometimes third generation of migrant women. I'm speaking about women specifically now, because this is our target group. But it's an important group, which is very often completely overlooked. So a lot of attention is going towards refugees and asylum seekers at the moment, which is perfectly understandable with the volume of asylum seekers and specific vulnerability they're placed in. Slightly less attention at the moment goes towards migrants, and generally the work done on the integration, long-term integration into European society, is receiving less and less attention now at the European Union level. And the third group that is totally overlooked is the ethnic minority people. So here we have groups of, it can be an Afghani people, or Syrians, or Sub-Saharan Africans, or Latin women who are sometimes they're born in the European Union, or maybe their mother was born in the European Union. So it's the third generation women who not only face very serious ethnic and racist discrimination, but also they continue living in what we call the self-segregated communities. So as a matter of fact, we, or I should say our members, work with certain women who are second generation migrant women who actually practically speak no local language, and they have never managed to integrate in the local society. They are so closed within their own ethnic group. So, can go to the next slide. Okay. Yes. Now we go into more specific. So this was general definitions. I wanted to speak about them because whatever we discuss from now on, we should discuss it at the backdrop of those different groups that I mentioned. They will have different dynamics within those different groups and populations of migrants. And the better we understand those definitions, the better we can analyze specific types of violence that women are facing within their own communities, and the better we are prepared to develop tools for intervention. Now, going into various types of violence that migrant women are facing. Here I have to make an important introductory point. First of all, we are not speaking here about violence against migrant women. We are speaking about violence against women. And this is a fundamental point and an entry point into our discussion. So whatever we think about migrants, about different ethnic groups, about different cultural difference, When we speak about violence against women, we stick to the legal definitions, to the international definitions that thankfully already exist. They have been defined, they're entrenched in different legislation. So this is absolutely the starting point for any discussion. Once we are clear about this, that we are speaking about violence against women, then we can go into analyzing cultural aspects and cultural manifestations and how to mediate it better within different cultural and ethnic settings. Having said this, it's also important to know that certain ethnic groups or cultural groups, or sometimes religious groups, they would be found more prevalent or more frequent types of violence against women. And we have to be honest about it, and we have to be clear about it. So speaking about, for example, the first type that I have is traditional harmful practices. So this is an umbrella definition that would incorporate things like forced and arranged marriages and female genital mutilation. But there is also something called abandonment, for example. This is when men would want to divorce from their wives because they want to get married again, and they could, for example, send their wives back home to the country of origin and kind of abandon them there because they have the power to do so. So these specific types of violence against women, such as forced and arranged marriage and female genital mutilation, they are prevalent within certain ethnic groups. It would be unfair to say that they have the same manifestation and the same scope and volume within all migrant communities. I will not go into details as to which specific groups have specific types of violence against women. It is a very important discussion to have on its own because we need to approach it very carefully in order not to create disproportionate or wrong image of specific ethnic group. However, it is also very important to know in which group, which types of violence are more prevalent. The sexual exploitation, prostitution, sex trafficking, and online pornographic abuse, generally everything that has to do with sexual or sexualized exploitation is one of the, again, kind of cross-cutting types of violence. If you look at generally, this is violence against women, sexual and sexualized violence cross-cuts. So if you say, you take a case of a domestic worker who is filing her complaint. It's a labor dispute. She wants to leave her employer, and she wants to change her employer. And what very often our members discover is that inside this case, what looks like labor exploitation or some kind of labor dispute, there is a hidden element of sexual violence. Most often, 99% of the time, this will not even go on the file. This will not be recorded as part of the complaint, and this will not be dealt with. I mean, normally this would be a part of a criminal justice, actually. So sometimes it can be sexual harassment at work, but most often women do not even want to speak about this. So they consider themselves very lucky if their case goes through and she receives a permission from a migration authority to change her employer under conditions of labor exploitation. But our experience tells us that inside pretty much every case of domestic worker exploitation, you can find inside elements of sexual violence. And so the reason I'm mentioning this is that in other forms of exploitation of women, because they are women, because as women we are sexually exploited and we live in the conditions of patriarchy, the element of sexual violence is almost always present. Then we have forced sterilization, forced contraception. I won't go into this. Of course, domestic violence. Now, this is probably what interests you. It's also very related within specific ethnic groups with honor-based violence. I again do not have time to explain, and I hope that you have a basic idea of honor-based. Why is it called honor-based? It is based on the false concept of honor, which eventually is placed on a woman as a carrier of family. It's a man's honor, family honor, and community honor that is placed on a woman. And if she transgresses specific rules, such as no mixing with other ethnic groups, or interreligious marriage, or having sex outside of marriage, or a specific inappropriate behavior, she will be subject to punishment from by honor-based violence. The most severe form would be femicide, that she would be murdered. Domestic servitude and slavery, I mentioned before, domestic work. So in this respect, a lot of women are subjected to severe forms of labor exploitation that eventually amounts into practically the form of slavery. And then we have also the instances of discriminations against women. Have here reduced education opportunities and discrimination in inheritance. This is exercised against women within their own ethnic groups and families very often. Reduced educational opportunities primarily arise from the fact of the burden of family care that is placed on women, and low expectations of their participation in public, political, or life and labor market. Discrimination in inheritance also happens, and of course, if this happens within the European legislation, it's simply not possible according to the law. However, certain ethnic groups do practice their own family law and personal law, which is done by the kind of the local councils within the community, who may decide that the woman does not exercise the same right in inheritance as her brother, for example, or as her spouse. Now, I can go on about different forms of violence. There are a lot of them. It's important to remember that they all come and manifest from the patriarchal structures, that those patriarchal structures are universal. They're not limited to any specific groups. They are absolutely present within any European community. However, it is very important to be honest about the fact that in certain ethnic groups, certain types of violence are more prevalent. What is also important to remember that all of this is happening, which I highlighted in red, at the background of low reporting, low documentation, and culture of disbelief. This is not an issue of ethnic minority groups or migrants or refugees. This is an issue of patriarchy. Women are afraid to report. Women are afraid to disclose violence, and women do not think that they will be believed. They do not go to the police, and very often they're right because they are not believed, and their evidence is not taken as evidence. So what we have police actually saying in the cases of violence happening within specific ethnic groups, that we won't be intervening, this is just their culture, this is how they deal with women, we shouldn't be dealing with this. For them it is normal. So this is why women migrate, and I'm sure that again you would know the basic push factors why women decide to either migrate for economic reasons or for family reunification very often. Then there are more difficult reasons for migration, such as war and forced displacement and natural disaster and religious political persecution. These are all the aspects of migration that we know, that are talked about, that are dealt with at the level of law, and it's easy to mention them. What is not easy to mention and what is not talked about is the actual male, sexist, and patriarchal violence that women are fleeing. This cause and the push factor for migration receives very little attention. there is very little understanding that a lot of women, and now I'm speaking mostly actually about refugee women, that a lot of the cases that our members are dealing with, when you start analyzing the case, what you see is the pattern of male violence that the woman is trying to escape. When they're applying, sometimes even when they're arriving with their families, when they arrive with their husbands, very often woman wants and she asks for independent legal status. And very often the assumption is that we have this happy, heterosexual family unit, and the European kind of understanding of this, that it's in the best interest of the families to be together, so we put them together. They reject very often the independent claim for refugee status from women. Male becomes the main kind of representative in the asylum case, and then there's a family that comes together with the man. This is very dangerous. It's also unfair to women because it impacts women at so many levels and in such a profound way. This legal dependency on their male spouses in terms of economic opportunities, in terms of their participation in public life, in terms of course, the burden of family care that is placed on them. And it is important to remember that male violence would be something that entitles women for refugee status. It's a ground for asylum, and very often, if not most often, women do not know about this. Only when they're told that actually this and this form of violence that happened with you entitles you to apply for asylum on other grounds rather than political persecution, and it makes your case stronger, they become very surprised. Laws and policies, I want to mention this because we do deal, of course, with several tiers, levels of laws and policies that help us to work with migrant populations and migrant women specifically, but also analyze the cases of discrimination. Of course, the international level is very, very important for us, and CEDAW would be the kind of the primary point of reference for us from the feminist perspective, as well as the Protocol on Trafficking, ILO Convention on Domestic Workers, not adopted by most EU countries who receive most domestic workers. Then we have the Refugee Convention that is gender blind completely, but there are certain guidelines that were developed later that we can use in order to give a gender sensitive perspective on the Refugee Convention articles. And then we have the European law, Istanbul Convention, our main reference point at the moment, and a lot of debate is going around, a lot of pushback on the convention, as we know. There are a number of EU directives as well, and then we have national policies and laws. What is important to remember here is that subsidiarity principle of the European Union, right? So that means that a certain area of decision making for the European Union, they have very little scope where they can exercise or impose pressure on the states. And migration would be one of such areas. And this places us in a very difficult situation because we do have good European, or maybe not so good, but at least some laws at the European level. We should be in the position to ask member states to implement those laws. However, there are specific limitations as how far the Commission can go. And this is why we have the situation when countries like Hungary says that we're going to accept 0 refugees. Of course, the European Commission now is kind of taking sort of legal action against them. But it's important that most things, we have the laws and we have all of those wonderful, European level directives, but the real things are happening on the ground and they are happening inside member states. And this is where the attention and the analysis and the real work is happening there. our organizations are working locally, and sometimes it's very difficult even to bring them at the European level, because for them it's like, well, this is just too far away. It makes no sense to us. It doesn't bear immediate relevance onto our work. Another complication when we work within migrant communities is with migrant women, right? Violence against migrant women within migrant communities. There is a gap between two sets of laws. We have the laws that deal with violence against women. These are the laws that we need, because these are the laws that are there specifically to protect women from violence. And then there are laws on migration. These are also important laws for us. However, the two areas, and it starts from the European Commission level, where you have DG Justice and you have DG Home, they're not really communicating very well. The same kind of lack of communication trickles down, and we find that at the level of grassroots work, where very often the organizations that are working on with migrant populations, they do not really take gender approach. They, of course, most of them are not feminist, unfortunately. And very often they overlook specific needs of women. I give here one example. It's a refugee girl child. It is actually, where you have the intersection of three areas. So you have the laws on children, very important. Then we have laws on violence against women, and then we have refugee laws. In order for us to really understand the case, we have to bring the three areas of analysis, three areas of expertise and intervention, and put them together, something that is called intersectionality, But this is very important to take cases of gender-based violence, violence against women in migrant communities, by incorporating this multiple perspectives, legal perspective and perspective of methodology and intervention. So now what we have here, I'm describing the current situation, right? So we have what is called the refugee crisis, which is not the refugee crisis for us. And then we have political and financial crisis and populist and far-right backlash and fundamentalist backlash. And also quite weak response from progressive kind of elements that we would expect that they would support the migrants, they would combat discrimination against migrant women. So we have massive backlash from the right and very weak response from the left. As a result, migrant women are kind of abandoned. This is what we have right now. So we are already falling in between the cracks from the legal perspective. As I mentioned before, we have laws on violence against women, and then we have laws on migration or like anti-racist initiatives. And then in terms of what is actually happening politically, we don't have anywhere to go to. Who are our allies? We want to speak about violence within migrant women communities. Do we want, to sit on the same panel with far right who are happy to speak about this? No, we don't. So we go to those organizations working, the left, but they don't want to speak about those issues because they don't want to sound racist, and because there are issues of culture, and we don't want to deal with culture, and it all becomes very sensitive. It has a profound long-term impact, this kind of lack of support on migrant and refugee women. So we are living under external pressures that are very, very real. They're legal, racist, sexist, that are when I say external, I mean outside of our own ethnic communities. And then we have internal pressures coming from this male violence that I described before, but also family and community. It's very important to have this concept of community in mind, because within many ethnic groups, if we're speaking about the sub-Saharan Africa or MENA or Middle East, Latina women, the concept of community and communal life is so important. And it is also the result, of course, of self-defense and self-protection. You do tend to go towards your own ethnic groups when you don't know the language, when you do not know the local culture and the laws, and then you become enclosed in this. And this is the next point is self-imposed segregation. I mentioned it in relation to second generation, sometimes third generation migrant groups, and we are doing a lot of initiatives and consciousness raising on this subject, because we believe that the process of migration on its own means that we already stepped out of our ethnic mentality and group. So it's very unhelpful to remain in this segregated environment. And at the background of this, what is happening as well, and that's good news, that we have a lot of very strong feminist initiatives, women's groups within migrant communities who are doing amazing work. There will be a lot of our members are doing this. They are on the forefront of the feminist work and raising awareness and doing work within their own groups. And I invite everyone, I don't know how many of you are actually working with migrants or working on this issue of violence against women within migrant populations, but I very strongly encourage everyone who does so, when you go to specific ethnic groups, look for those women, identify those women, those leaders, those feminists inside those ethnic groups, and take leadership from them. So this is what we have here, and I know I have 5 minutes left, and I think I will be done. What we are, let's say, expecting or asking, and this is a real need on the ground. We have a lot of conversations are going around inclusion. Let's include women. Let's include migrants. We disagree with this. Let's not include. In our perspective, we need to prioritize women. So we need to, that's a general feminist demand. We don't want to be included anywhere. We want to take leadership. And the same way it should be applied when you work with migrant populations. We encourage everyone to take migrants and refugees equally and recognize their agency, as opposed to taking the charity approach. And this process of recognition and treating migrants as your equals also involves, of course, the criticism. So, saying that things are recognizing and naming violence against women as violence against women is an okay thing to do, because you treat migrants as equal to you. You expect from them the same, and you believe that migrant women deserve the same rights. Of course, very important is the question of visibility. What do we actually discuss? Do we have the data? Do we have the statistics? Do we have the evidence? Do women themselves have the voice to speak about the violence? Because even from the data, starting from the data collection level, there is not enough evidence for us to speak about violence. Next point as a woman on this space is that I can't emphasize enough how important it is that there exist projects, funding specific groups that are dealing with women specifically and are led by women. And another one is mixed ethnic group. Also, again, I mentioned it earlier that one, and this is a very important point, do not reproduce what is being reproduced within migrant groups. So what is happening here? We have an Afghani group, here we have a Russian group, here we have Ukrainians, and they're all doing their ethnic things. It's all fine. But if you want to work with migrants, and if you want to succeed in breaking barriers that exist horizontally within different ethnic groups and vertically as well, then we need to do the mixed groups. It's a very tricky and sensitive and difficult subject, but I thought it's very important to mention it. And then, well, this, I guess, would be your specialist program for men. We do not work with this. What I can tell you, just one thing. When our last trip in Eleona's camp in Greece, there are a lot of programs generally in Greece, as probably in Italy, that are trying to help women. And there are not enough and a lot of them are not doing it in a way that is being particularly helpful. But what is really lacking is specialist programs for men, because it's like they're coming there and they do not know what to do with men. There are groups of men, they're mostly young men, they in-group together, there is serious risk of radicalization, there is psychological frustration, there is a lot of trauma that those men are carrying. These problems are real, and there is absolute big gap into services provided to those men. Effective services. I don't mean just, getting them together to play a bit of football, but even this is also important. I finish here with a question. Well, for me, it's not a question, but it is a more general question. This is a case that happened a couple of weeks ago. I mean, it happened before, but it gained media visibility a couple of weeks ago. So we had a woman from Pakistan, in Italy. She's actually Italian citizen, and she was sent to Pakistan. We don't know exactly why. We can speculate. The point is that she was, well, allegedly she was murdered there. Now, we believe from our understanding that this is the case of honor killing. It is the case of a woman being forced into marriage that she refused, and therefore she was murdered. The perpetrator is her own family or extended family. And the discussion on this is difficult. The discussion is not happening because it's their culture. It's something that they do. There's a lot of othering happening here. And then at the same time, you have the kind of those far right people jumping in and saying, hey, but this is how those people are anyway, so let's kick them out all of Italy or from Europe. So what I'm kind of leading towards is this question of culture of violence. I think if you are to engage substantively within migrant populations, this is a question that needs to be addressed. There has to be, I started from this, violence against women is violence against women. It is not culture, it is not religion, it is not tradition, it is simply violence. We have laws for this, we refer to them, we have analysis, we have feminist analysis. We need to take leadership from there, and all of those arguments about how this is this is what they do in their culture, they need to be rejected in order for us to really treat migrant women as our equals who deserve the same fundamental rights. I think I'm going to stop here, and we can go into question and answer. Oh yes, this is my thank you. Please feel free to contact us anytime. Obviously, this is my personal email, and visit our website, our Facebook, follow us on media. What do you say in the end of presentation? And thank you very much for listening to me. Yes, I can hear you.
Because we just switched offices and we have new internet, and apparently it's not that good.
I can hear you well.
Can everybody else hear me?
And now I can't hear anything.
Apologies, the internet keeps. I hope I'm gonna stay online.
Now we can hear
So,
you, yes.
very good. So the idea is that anybody who has any questions for Anna, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation.
You're very welcome.
Now use the chat to ask questions. So please feel free to simply type your questions into the chat that is at the bottom. You've been using it to tell me you can hear me, so I know you know the chat is there. So feel free to ask any questions. I see a couple of people typing.
So we have 11 participants. That's good.
Yes. Nancy would like to ask some more info about mixed ethnic group interventions.
Mhm.
Is there, Nancy, do you want to ask a more specific question, or would you just generally like to hear more about that?
So is it specific or not?
Nancy's still typing, I think. Okay. Nancy says that they are trying to set up interventions for migrant women, but
Uh-huh.
they generally go to each ethnic group community in their town. It is sometimes difficult to work with migrant women as far as domestic violence is concerned. Can you advise on strategies to overcome isolation and cultural ostracism within communities towards women who speak up about home violence?
Oh, yeah, it's a very important question. Thank you for asking this. Look, there is there is no recipe for this. So it depends where you are. It depends what ethnic group you're talking about. It also depends the the kind of the journey of a family or a woman where they are, not only physically, I mean by this maybe they just arrived, but also mentally. um, for us, how we work, and when I say we, I don't mean myself personally, even though I do work, I work with migrant women every day. I work with our own members who are migrant women. But then when I speak about us, how we work, I really mean, of course, our members who work, like our member in Greece who receives 150 refugee women per day. uh, you have to know, or you have to be aware that you will not be very successful if you go inside the environment where violence is happening or is likely to happen, or there is a presence of potential perpetrator. The chances of success within this environment are very small. You need to take the women out. You need to create the space where women will feel safe, confident, nurtured in a sense, away from the environment which generated the violence. This is not something that is specific to migrant women or ethnic groups. It's specific to anybody, any victim of domestic violence. Of course, uh, we know that women are punished for speaking up. Women are murdered sometimes for speaking up within their own groups. They are accused of betraying their cultural values. They're accused of betraying their religion. They're accused of westernization, and they're having really hard time. Going inside, kind of doing the intervention in the community, honestly, I think it's very tricky. And I think that you would need to have cultural mediators. You will need to have men on board who will be speaking, very importantly. You will need to identify specific leaders among women who are, who have real feminist analysis, because you would hear sometimes from the women, they would say, yeah, okay, this is violence, but it's also a little bit complicated. They can say things like this. And we do not want the discussions at this level. We want a very clear understanding of, the difference between what is violence and what is not violence. To develop those discussions and to give the women tools to analyze it, or to to argue about this, because I can assure you, pretty much every woman knows at intuitive level it is violence. We don't enjoy being beaten up and being assaulted, or verbally, called sluts and bitches and so on. But the language that we have to defeat those arguments, we're not born with those arguments and with those language and terms. And we need to take, from our experience, we need to have the spaces where we can bring the women in a safe place, in a structured place, where we can work together and where we can sit around the table. This is what we do. We have women. One woman is from Nigeria, the other one is from Kenya. We have somebody from Ghana, and then we have women from Morocco, and then we have women from Syria and Afghanistan. And we sit around the table and we discover that what happens within these very diverse ethnic groups, with very different sometimes manifestation, is actually pretty much the same. It is called patriarchal male violence that is done to us because we are women. When we discover those commonalities among us, this is when we start breaking cultural, religious, ethnic, linguistic barriers. Because we know it doesn't happen to me because I'm Russian, it doesn't happen to me because I'm Nigerian, it happened to me because I'm a woman. So, in mixing the groups, our work, of course, we mix women, very, very important. And also to, to break the stereotypes, because you would have very often women are saying, oh, but that's, it's not just white women saying something about black women, or about, I don't know, brown women or Muslim women. There is a lot of horizontal stereotyping that goes within communities, and those interethnic tensions and competitions and prejudices, they're carried from the countries of origin. So we generally, we do not just, I wouldn't go into some district or community and say, hey, we bring everybody on board here and we mix everyone and we start this discussion. We do it very carefully with women, with very specific, well, it's what we call in traditional terms, the feminist consciousness raising methodology. When we speak about personal issues, we discuss our personal histories, we identify with each other despite our differences. We develop our analysis, and this empowers women to go back to the community and carry out the work that we support. So this would be my advice. Look for women, look for feminists within the community, bring them on board, develop methodology together, and create the spaces that would allow them to get out of the ethnic enclosure into the space where they can identify with women with other different groups. And it's a very empowering experience, in my personal experience even. Don't know if it was helpful.
Beatrice, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, says, thank you, great material to work with.
Okay.
We have another question from Lola. Nancy also says thank you. We have a question from Lola, and she says, hello, we are setting up a group of mixed migrant women in Dublin. It is a group for migrant women where they can feel comfortable to speak, and we're starting to do some workshops. We want to make official our group to be able to do fundraising, but we are not sure what type of institution, company we can register it like. Any suggestions from your experience? Maybe charity? Question mark.
Okay, so in Ireland, well, first of all, we have very, very strong members in Ireland. Our president is Salome Mbugua, who is quite known in Ireland. She's now the Commissioner for Human Rights, and she has an organization, Akidwa. So I do not know where you're based, if it's in Dublin. I would definitely advise you to actually have a chat with either, I can connect with women managers in Akidwa, so that they can share experience. What I know is that there are two types of structures that you can register. One would be a charity, yes, it's a traditional charity, and then the other one would be something that is called this enterprise. It also allows you to earn money. So if you want to do some kind of activities, I don't know, trainings or produce some materials, the income will have to go back to your organization. But another thing, question of funding is very important one. It's always an important one. But let's be clear that this should not be the first question. The first question is, what do you want to do, and why do you want to do it? A lot of charities are being set up with ideas that I mean, I do not know why they're there, actually, these people. It's very important that even if you don't have funds, this is our principles in the network. We're not big network with like have big office with a lot of member staff and big salaries. We work very we don't have centralized government, I wanted to say, not management. We're very grassroots driven and very participatory. We're driven by our members. And for us, a very important principle, and I think that's a principle that's a little bit lost in the NGO world because it became so institutionalized and so commercialized, is that we have a set of goals, and we know that we're going to work on them regardless whether we have funding or not. Because our goals are, I mean, we work with violence against women. Let's be clear, there are no funding, or there are very little funding for violence against women. It's not a fancy subject. Nobody wants to deal with this. The European Commission had gender equality strategy for 5 years, and now they didn't renew it. So what does it mean? That means that the European Commission thinks that violence against women is kind of a subject that we already covered. Gender equality, no longer, we don't need it. We now move to other subjects. There's a lot of perceptions that we live in a kind of post-patriarchal society, that we do not need anymore kind of feminism, and gender equality is already here. So you will face a lot of obstacles when it comes to funding, and it should not discourage you. If you believe in this, if you think that needs to be done, you will do it anyways. And a lot of our members, not a lot, but some, actually, they are informal groups. They are groups that do amazing work on specific areas, but they're not necessarily big charities, with status and receiving funding and so on. But I have to say that please do connect with Akidwa in Ireland, and you will receive an advice on how to formalize, where to look for funds, maybe some ways to cooperate with them, do some things together.
So Anna, quick question. Would it be okay if Lola sent you an email and you introduced?
Of course, certainly.
Cool.
Yeah.
Lola, would that work for you? She's typing. Lola's saying, okay, great, thanks, Emil. So I think you really helped there. If there aren't any other questions, I would like to lead over to a short survey.